On this episode of the Low Carb Cook, it's the Holy Grail, handmade, light and fluffy white keto bread. And in this edition, I'll be showing you the more manual method to prepare and self-bake this recipe. Now, if there's one thing people will tell you they just cannot live without when they're starting a keto or low carb lifestyle, it's bread, and in particular, white bread. So if you're one of those people, well, don't worry, I have an amazing base white bread recipe that you can make really easily at home that works perfectly for sandwiches, burgers, and toast alike. Now, this recipe isn't really for you if you're just starting keto, and if you're still very focused on losing weight, be aware that this can slow that process down if you overindulge. But if you're on target and you want to enjoy this staple, you can make this anytime. So let's get started. So we're starting today with 75 grams of almond flour, 240 grams of vital wheat gluten. That's what gives bread its natural elasticity. So this is what's going to make it feel and taste like natural bread. Then we have just half a teaspoon of xanthan gum, a pinch of salt. You really don't want too much salt, that will kill the yeast, so be careful with that. Then we have 40 grams of erythritol as our sweetener, and that's powdered erythritol, so we don't want the grittiness of granulated. 40 grams of softened salted butter, 2 eggs, and then my special secret ingredient, I'm using 30 grams of bamboo fiber or bamboo flour. Now this is really popular in Asia in their cuisine. It's almost zero carbohydrate, so it's absolutely ideal for using in low carb or keto foods, and it's going to add some of that fluffiness into the bread. Now we want 250 ml or 1 cup of lukewarm water, that's about 25 degrees centigrade. 1 teaspoon of honey, that's just to feed the yeast. Anything left from that in terms of carbs will be removed by the yeast. I'm going to add 4 drops of stevia. Now that's because in the Western world, we're very used to our white bread being very sweet, so that's going to help trick the palate on that side. And when it comes to that all-important yeast ingredient, I like using these 7-gram foil packs. This is just a supermarket-owned brand, but I always find I get the best rise when I use these. So before we get started on our bread, first we need to create a nice, warm, moist environment for our dough to rise in. So I've got my bottom oven on, and I'm going to fill a baking tray with pre-boiled water, just to create a bit of a steam bath in there. I'll pop that in the bottom of the oven. I'm not actually putting the oven on. This is just going to create a moist environment. That's also going to help make the bread a bit crunchy on top later on during the cook. So our bread making, off we go. The next thing we're going to do is sieve everything. This is really important to sieve these ingredients through because we don't want any lumps in there, but it's also going to help get some air in straight away. So we'll start with our vital wheat gluten and our almond flour. Now you're going to get some lumps in with that almond flour anyway, and that really is fine. They can go straight back in on top, but it's the big lumps that we're trying to take away. And you'll see those left in there in a second. Just break a few of those up. There we go, and you can see how much of this is quite a fine grit, but that's okay in the bread. The main thing we need to sieve is our bamboo fiber. This tends to clump up in storage, and it's very fine when it is sieved, but we don't want any big lumps in there. It's a bit like cotton wool. There we go. And these last few pieces left, they're just not going to go, so we'll leave those out. Next, our erythritol. So you really do get some quite big lumps in there. We want to get rid of those. Our xanthan gum, and finally our pinch of salt. There we go. Now it's quite important the order in which we put the ingredients into our dish. And at the bottom we want our water and eggs. That's so it doesn't mix with the yeast and start straight away. So I'm going to crack my eggs. I always crack eggs into a separate container just to make sure I'm not getting any shell in there. There we go. And I'm going to grab a fork and just break the yolks up. Yeah. And I'm going to add my stevia in here so all the liquids stay together. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now on top of that, we add all of our dry ingredients. I'm going to give them a quick stir through in the bowl, just to start blending them now. Yeah. And then tip that in on top of the fluids. Now I'm just going to make a small well in the top of that to add my yeast. Sprinkle that into the center. And this is where we add our teaspoon of honey. Now remember, that honey, it's not adding a lot of carbs in there because that yeast really is going to remove most of that. This is what feeds the yeast and then creates all that gas in there that's going to give you all that nice light aerated bread. There we go. And lastly, I've got 40 grams of salted butter. It's quite soft already, so it mixes in well. And I'm just going to sprinkle that around the edges of the bowl. Now, if I'm making this in a bread maker, I must admit, I don't normally measure it out like this. I just eyeball it with a teaspoon, and I find it's enough. And I probably end up putting in slightly less than I'm using in this recipe. Now, I'm using a proper kneading attachment for this machine today, just as I would with a standard bread, and that really helps. Now with these machines, it doesn't always catch everything, so don't be afraid. You might have to stop it every so often, pull it in from the sides, get it back into the center and let that paddle do its work. But we can start that off on a medium speed. So this really is a patience game. It takes a while for that machine to start picking all that up and blending it all together. While it's doing that, I'm gonna have a quick clear up. There, that's come together really beautifully now. It's really catching that dough and stretching the gluten to activate everything. That's going to give you a really good rise. So don't be afraid to leave it in there for a couple of minutes. That's doing all that hard work for you. There we go. We've got a really fantastic looking ball of dough going on now. Pull it all out. It's nice and clean around the sides. If your dough is still a little wet and a little sticky, then you can give it a bit of loop-in flour or something similar on your work surface and stretch it out a little more. I really don't think that needs it. I mean, look how elastic that is, and pulling that apart, you can really see that gluten elasticity going on in there. So the next thing for me, go back to our glass bowl, and I'm going to spray mine with some coconut oil, just so this dough doesn't stick to the bottom of the bowl. I'm going to plonk that in there and cover it with a clean tea towel. It's going to let some of the moisture from the oven through, and then we'll put that in our lower oven. Remember, this oven isn't on, it's just got a steam bath in there, and I'm going to leave that in there to rise for about 45 minutes, and I'll see you back here in a jiffy. So welcome back to our nice clean kitchen. Our dough has been rising in the oven now for 45 minutes, so we're going to pull that out. Now, before we get ready to put it back in the oven, just quickly turn your oven on to its lowest temperature, just to re-warm that water, re-warm the oven. That's going to help with our second rise. Let's have a look. You can see that has expanded quite nicely in that pan. Not maybe as much as a traditional bread, but that's okay. So we're going to give this a second kneading now to give it a finer gluten structure before we place it back in for its final rise. I'm using loop-in flour here just to dust my surface. Loop-in flour is something I use in various keto cooking, like my keto pasta. There's another video on that. Do make sure you check that one out. But this is definitely fluffier than it was before. We're finished with that now. But I'm going to knead it again. As I say, we're going to stretch it out. It feels more rubbery in the hand now and feels much more like a traditional dough. But stretching that gluten out for a second time, it may feel unnecessary, but the eventual result with your loaf is worth all the effort. Now, people do this in lots of ways. They pick it up and slam it down. Personally, I like the good old-fashioned push with the palm of the hand. And all I'm doing there is squashing it down, pushing it forward, and then bringing it back and turning it every so often as we do that. There. Now what I'm going to do is start folding it in on itself underneath the base like that, and then turn that up so that's upside down, and then use our final baking tin, place that inside. Now before this goes back into the oven, do remember to turn that oven off again. We don't want to start cooking this just yet. We just wanted to get it warm again. That's going back into that nice, moist, warm environment for another 45 minutes to an hour for its final rise before we bake it. While we do that, let's have a look at the macros. I love to watch my bread rise, and you join me down here on the low carb kitchen floor, and there's nothing wrong with getting down on the floor and watching stuff happen in the oven. Let's take a look at what that's been doing. There, that is looking absolutely perfect. I mean, that's an incredible rise for a keto loaf. So we're going to pop that straight back in, and we're going to whack that up now to about 180 degrees for 25 to 30 minutes. And I'm going to let you watch that bit too. And there she blows, one perfect white keto loaf. Now all you have to do is try and leave this to cool down, but sadly that doesn't always get afforded, that luxury, in my house. If you can leave this loaf alone though, it will cut really cleanly after 24 hours and give you a really neat slice, which in turn makes it way easier to count your carbs. But enough, let's tip this out and cut a slice and see how that looks. There. Perfect all the way round, and sounds like bread too. Let's bring in a cutting board. And this is the bit you want. This is what you've been waiting for. Cutting a slice off. There we go. Still steaming hot, but look at the inside of that bread. That is perfect, light, fluffy, well-proved bread. So how easy was that? I used this same recipe for making bread rolls, which you can find on another video here on my channel, along with a series of other recipes for different breads and ways to prepare and bake them. For all those and more, please subscribe to me here at the Low Carb Cook and hit that bell to be notified when I upload something new. In the meantime, I'm going to go and enjoy a nice bit of buttered toast with some sugar-free marmalade. Simple pleasures. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.
Hey, thanks for watching The Low Carb Cook. If you enjoyed this episode, why not watch one of our playlists or this recommended video? Click on the logo below to subscribe. Join us on any of our social pages, or if you'd like to show a bit more love, you can support the channel on buymeacoffee.com using the link below. For even more great stuff, check out the website, thelowcarbcook.com.